Jimmy Bogard, and I'm a principal consultant at Headspring. My contact information can be seen down there. And today I was going to be talking about putting your controllers on a diet. So I think it's a big problem in the United States today that our controllers are too fat, too heavy, we got too much stuff going on, too much code, too many responsibilities. And I think we can slim these controllers down so that it's much more declarative, much cleaner, and much easier to understand. This controller has too many actions, and try to break it out that way. But if you look at a single action, we can see that it's doing a lot of different things. This is the logon action. If I look at this, I can see that it's got this familiar kind of mountain range looking feel here, where you can see the braces going in and out, and it kind of looks like some kind of mountain range where I see peaks and valleys of following the braces and the tab indenting here. The other thing I see here are concerns that operate in different levels of different concepts. So what I mean by that is I see that at the top I'm checking model state that is valid. Now that right there, that's an MVC level concern. The model state is an MVC property. On the next level, I see a membership service. That's something at a different conceptual layer than model state, but I'm seeing this in the exact same method. So irregardless of all the number of if statements, I'm now operating, mentally I'm operating at several different conceptual levels, where I'm operating at the UI level here, and model state is valid. And then down here, this is these kind of lower level infrastructure level services like validating a user, signing in, and whatnot. You can see that after I validate my user, if something goes wrong, I go back to the upper level conceptual level of the UI layer dealing with model state. So just this one controller action has several different levels of concepts going on that even if it was all one level, I would still have a hard time understanding exactly what's going on here because it's touching so many different layers. Now this one is kind of easy to pick on, but here's another example in my conference controller where I can see the same kind of things happening. So if I scroll down to my my post action that's handling the edit post, I see the same kind of thing going on. I see that here I'm still having to check model state to do redirecting if the form is not valid. But then I see the actual processing of the form. This is more domain level concerns of interacting with my domain model and updating it according to what the form has. And if there were other, bigger level validation concerns I had to do, for example, if the attendee email had to be unique inside a conference, that would be another piece here I'd see that would kind of cloud what's going on with the form post. Another really easy way to see if my controller is doing too much is just to look at the using statements. And a lot of legacy code I've worked with, the using statements can stretch all the way down to the bottom of my screen because the class is so big and touching so many things. You can have a class that has too much responsibility where it's just using something like system and it's just become a big ball of mud where everything goes into. But you also have these pieces where the coupling is really high because my class is touching so many external pieces. In fact, right here you can see all the different layers I'm dealing with. I'm dealing with the UI layer because I'm using System Web MVC. I'm dealing with my domain layer because I'm interacting with my core domain layer. And here you see also infrastructure level concerns by accessing repositories, and maybe there's some other level of infrastructure level concern. And then also that I'm interacting with other pieces of my UI layer. So right here you see at least 3 layers that I'm interacting with in one single class. And I don't know about everyone else, but I have a really hard time keeping everything straight to begin with. And once I have a class that's now poking out into all these different concerns, I just have a hard time understanding what's going on. And then later on when I need to change it, how to change it effectively without breaking my application. So even this controller, even though it's just a simple CRUD controller, I think has too many responsibilities. It's too fat because it has too much code. And each individual action is pretty hard to decipher exactly what's going on. Here's one that's just an edit action. I get a conference, loaded up by name. I project into some form object that I built specifically to display a conference in a form, and then I show the view. So even just looking at that, I would be a little bit annoyed if I had to go change this code and make sure that I didn't break anything, that I mapped this all correctly, that I got the repository item out correctly, and all the things like that. So what I see here is a lot of different concepts, a lot of different responsibilities, and I'm hitting a lot of different points and different layers of my application. So this is what I consider a fat controller. But I think we can do better. I think we can slim this down, get each action where I can look at it and understand exactly what it's doing with the least amount of code, not change the behavior, but just change the responsibility slightly so that my conference controller is no longer deciding what to do and how to do it, but it's really just being the traffic cop and deciding what to do and letting other pieces figure out the how. So the first piece I'd like to put in is dependency inversion. If we go back to our conference controller, we can see that it's using a repository, but it's deciding exactly how it needs to get that repository. So it goes out, news up a conference repository. The conference repository has some kind of database access connection that it needs to get to, so it gets to the static property. So right away you see here that the conference controller is responsible for locating the conference repository as well as any lifecycle management. So it has to know that this conference repository is instantiated once per controller and that the sessions.current is some kind of static property. So right in this one line of code, we've got a couple different responsibilities that my controller has to figure out. If I have a lot of these controllers that had to figure out how to locate all of its dependencies, control the lifecycle and things like that, they can just become a lot for the controller to manage. It's something we could just get rid of pretty easily with dependency injection. So the first thing I want to do is add a custom controller builder so that I can use an inversion of control container to instantiate my controllers instead of my controller going out and figuring out its own dependencies. So what this will do for me is allow me to just let my conference controller depend on a conference repository and then let something else be responsible for injecting that conference repository into my conference controller. All right, so the first thing I need to do, a little toolbox here. So I'm going to get rid of this no-R constructor and replace it with one that now takes the conference repository as an argument. So now instead of my conference controller locating the conference repository and a specific implementation, I'm just going to have the conference controller depend on a conference repository, meaning that when a conference controller depends on this, it means that it cannot function unless this conference repository is supplied, or specifically an implementation of a conference repository is supplied. And now all concerns of lifecycle and things like that are just all externalized, and now my conference controller really needs to just be concerned with, here's what I need to work, and I'll let something else figure out how to give me the things that I need. So let's hook up that other piece, which is the ability to allow the conference controller to be instantiated and things plugged in like the conference repository. So if I go to my global.asax, the application start where I have all of the other bootstrapping code, we'll just ignore the rest of this stuff. This is just kind of default stuff I put in every project. Things like registering the areas, the routes, setting model metadata providers, and setting up my inversion control container with structure map. And this is just loading dummy data. So what I'm doing here is I'm setting the current controller factory by accessing the controller builder.current .set controller factory method. This is all MVC right here, and this piece over here on the right is something I created. And all this controller factory is doing is using our container to instantiate a controller, as opposed to the normal way is just to look for a no-R constructor and instantiate that via reflection. All right, so once I have those pieces in place, my conference controller is going to be injected, is going to have this conference repository now injected into it, as opposed to it going out and locating the correct implementation and all that. So let me rebuild and refresh my screen just to make sure everything's still working properly. Okay, so if I just refresh this page, it all should still work. Okay, so it looks like it loaded up properly and everything's still working. All right, so that's just one easy thing I can do. Now this conference controller and the conference repository just had one level dependencies, but if it got a little bit more hairy where I have different life cycles I needed to manage, for example, if one piece was singleton, if another piece had to be managed as, each request gets its own instance, like through session or HTTP context, that would start to get pretty complicated and start to really grow the amount of code that I had to care about. But if I just externalize that into my my IOC container, then all my controller needs to be concerned with is just, putting out a list of what I need to work, and I'll let something else figure out how to plug it all in. The next piece we see is all this mapping code. I'm displaying out a list of conference list models. I'm showing now my session, in my show, I have to show the name and all the sessions and things like that. My edit screen, I have a bunch of things I have to show on that as well. And each one of these is slightly different. Now, because I'm using the MVC2 feature of editor and display templates, I can now take advantage of things like view-specific models to put things like attributes in my model to help drive display of my screen. Now, I could put that on my entities, but I'll have situations where the piece I display in my show screen is different than the piece I show on my list screen. And so if that is one single object, I won't be able to distinguish those two. So by having these two different view models for each screen, then I can drive the display specifically through the design of the view model. In this case, I'm projecting my view model from the domain model. This is certainly not the only way to do it. I think the last session we saw where you can have an actual persistent view model. You can also do things like project from SQL. You can define views. You can define stored procedures. All these are different ways to basically project information that is specific to a single screen so that when I get to my view, I have a model that is designed just for that view, and all of its metadata information that will help drive the display is now defined on that specific model. This is a lot of the stuff that was pushed out with MVC2. So what I wanted to do for this piece is add AutoMapper, which is just a tool to help us map one object to another. As long as the names match up, I don't have to really do any extra code to get it to work. To introduce AutoMapper, the first thing I need to do is define my mappings between my source and destination types. My goal is to get rid of all of this left-hand side, right-hand side code. So all this piece where you see ID equals ID, name equals name, session count is session count, I can get rid of all of this code. As long as my names match up, I don't have to do anything extra. All right, so what I'll do is AutoMapper Boots. What I've done is I've created a Bootstrapper class that is going to hold all my configuration. I've just placed this in my UI project in a helpers folder. It doesn't really matter where this is go. The one thing about AutoMapper configuration is that you only have to configure my mappings once for app domain, so that means it's all static and singleton. I only need to configure the mappings once, and once I have them all configured, then I can just execute them at will, and I don't need to keep creating this configuration to map between two types. Okay, so I'm going to create separate configurations for displaying information versus editing information. So in AutoMapper, that's a concept of a profile. What I've done is created a viewModel profile class that inherits from this AutoMapper class called profile. And overriding the configure method, I call createMap to create a mapping configuration between the source and destination types. So these are all the display models I'm showing in my application. I'm showing a conference in the form of a conference list model. Again, and a conference in the form of a conference show model. And then again, on my conference show model, I'm also showing session and attendee information. So what I've done is create mapping configurations mapping from session to conference show model.session model. If I go look at my conference show model, we can see that it's a fairly flattened out version of my domain model. My domain model, for example, does not allow people to set the IDs, nor does it allow everyone to change the names. It also has things like I don't allow anyone to just add any session at will. I don't allow people to delete sessions. I don't allow people to insert sessions and things like that. So in my domain model, I only expose the operations that I allow. But in my view model, it's a much more DTO look and feel. You can think of it as kind of a serialization wire format, where if you look at this, it looks kind of like the format I would need if I wanted to export this as JSON or XML. Everything is exposed as getters and setters. Everything is exposed as very friendly model binding types, so arrays are here. I don't have things like collections or lists. It's all in terms of getters and setters and simple arrays. The other thing I've done is anytime I need to show any kind of child information, I define that as a nested class. And this is because I might show the session on more than one screen. And if I want to have metadata information, for example, this might have a display name that would drive something for, this would be something like for the MVC2 input or the display templates. So if I had something special for this screen that's made this display a certain way, so this might just display first name, where on the speaker show screen it shows speaker first name. This way I can kind of scope the information I'm showing so that my session model is scoped inside the conference show model. And the convention I'm using here is this is the controller name, this is the action name, and then, oops, the next piece is the action name, and then I just append it with model. So this is the model for the conference show action. And everything I need to show on there, I just dump in here. All right, so I created maps for all of my display entities, or my display screens. The next piece I'll have is one for my edit screens. This should be edit model profile. The same kind of thing where I have a map between my source type and my destination type, and now my destination type is this edit model. We can go see that on my edit model, it looks different than my show model. Here I'm allowing the editing of attendees, but I don't allow the editing of other pieces of information like the sessions. That's not going to be shown on the screen, so I create a model very specific for this screen. Now here I don't have any validation attributes, but this is where I would put all those data annotations and validation attributes, because it's my edit model that gets validated as part of a post, not my domain model. Okay, now that I have my two profiles created, this has created the map configurations between my source and destination types that I'm using. Now what I'm going to do is add a bootstrapper method here to initialize AutoMapper. And this was edit model profile now. From here I'm just calling the AutoMapper method. This is AutoMapper class here, mapper, calling the initialize method and telling it to add these two profiles. So it's just a static method here called initialize. There's nothing special about this class or this method. I'm just providing a public place where I can go call this initialize so they don't have it all in my global.asix class. So here I call initialize. I tell it to add these two profiles that I've created. And then when this gets executed, AutoMapper will go through these profiles and add these two configurations. At runtime, this also does a lot of runtime optimizations with reflection. So I'll do things like code generation behind the scenes, so I don't use the much slower reflection API. So this is one of the reasons why you want to have create this initialize only called once per application, because I do a lot of optimizations there at startup. All right, now that I have this initialize method going, I can go back to my global.asix and call that initialization here. So all I do is call AutoMapper bootstrapper.initialize, And again, this is in the application start event of my app, global.asax, so that means this is only going to get called once per app domain. Now that I call that, I can now use AutoMapper inside my controllers. So the next piece I want to do is, now that I have all my mappings configured, I'm going to go start deleting all of this heinous mapping code, all this junk right here. So with the power of copy and paste, I'm going to get rid of my existing code here and replace it with a substitute. So right before here, I'm going to, AutoMapper, I'm going to replace all of this code down here with this code up here. Yep, that is the model conference. I'm just getting some namespaces in. So here I want to make sure now I'm viewing, instead of the piece I projected, I'm just going to view this model that I've mapped over. So what I did was I replaced that query that was doing the projection with just a query that did the same thing, except now it returns just an array of conferences. Now that I have the array of conferences, I'm going to use AutoMapper to map between my array of conferences to my destination type, which is my view model, in this conference list model. And then I pass in my source type here. Now that I have that array, I show the view, and that mapped list of conferences is now displayed in the view. Now I haven't changed any of the functionality here. My view is still showing the array of conference list model. I've just changed how that mapping has happened. I'm just using AutoMapper to do it instead. So let me refresh my index page and make sure it's all working correctly. I did make sure and leave my laptop on high performance so that everything is still a little bit snappier than it might be otherwise. Okay, so conference is shown. That is working good. So let's go ahead and replace all this other code as well. I can now get rid of all of this mapping code as well, like that. Oops. So this whole piece where I'm mapping the model, I just delete all that. And that's now just one line of code where I map from conference that I pulled out of the repository to my conference show model. The same thing with my edit model. I'm just going to get rid of all that code. Okay, it's doing the exact same things behind the scenes. It works pretty much exactly how you'd expect it. So here, AutoMapper is able to find a method called getAttendees and map it to a property called attendees. It's able to map all these child objects as well, first name, last name, email. I don't have to do any extra configuration for arrays either. I just have to map the item type or the element type, and I get all the collection types for free. So this is one of my favorite things to do in my day-to-day work, delete code. Okay, that's all we can do for now. So you can see already that although we haven't changed the behavior of our actions, they're starting to get a lot smaller, and that's a good thing. If I look a little bit more closely at these guys, I start to see some other concepts start to jump out. One thing I see here is a common, some code that I can see that is common between these two actions. In both my show action and my edit action, I have this piece where I'm getting a conference out by name. Now, that might be okay for a couple actions, but if I start to get more and more of these controllers, then this kind of code just becomes repetitive of pulling something out. You'll have the show screen that you pass in the ID and it loads something out of the database by ID, and you keep seeing that concept over and over and over again. Well, this whole concept of loading something up by ID, that's something that we can more easily codify with another extensibility point in MVC, and that is going to be model binders. With model binders, I can kind of take all this this code where I'm deciding what to show and how to shape the incoming information. I can now use custom model binders to do a lot of that heavy lifting for me. So in the past, a lot of the examples of model binders I've seen are things like reshaping data that comes in. So one example would be like a date control that shows the hours, minutes, and seconds. In my model object, I'll have just a single date time. So that's an example where I'll have some kind of model binder where I reshape the form inputs coming in that have 3 text boxes, hour, minute, and second, or date, month, year, and I reshape that into a regular datetime object. We can also do things like replace this kind of code where I load up something from the database. We can replace that with model binding. So the first thing I need to do is to create this custom model binder. So I already have something created, it just doesn't do anything. So again, in my helpers folder, I created this conference model binder class, and I implement iModelBinder. That's the extensibility point from MVC. Right now, it's just doing nothing. You have a single method you need to override, and this is bindModel. I will say, though, that looking at the futures on ASP.NET MVC, the ASP.NET MVC site that is, there's still a lot of work going on to improve model binding. So I think that's something we can poke Phil for in his talk later this afternoon. All right, so I'm just going to fill this information in with basically the code I was doing in the conference controller to get a conference by event name. The idea is that I want to be able to, instead of have a string here, I can just pull in a conference, and I'll have model binding do all the work for me of pulling something out by name. Okay, so I'm a conference model binder. Again, pull that over. Most of this code is just the code I have to use to get stuff out of MVC. So this first piece is getting the original value from whatever I'm binding from. So I want to use the existing infrastructure to pull the information out of the query string. So with this call, I'm able to get the correct event name or conference name out of the query string. Okay, so the next piece I do, I'm going to instantiate my conference repository, and that's going to be my piece that actually loads up the conference name. Now, I have to call in Object Factory directly, but I think this is also something else that is being looked at for MVC3 to allow me to also use inversion and control containers in my model binders as well. The last piece I'm doing is replacing the conference controller repository that I get by name. I'm just going to put that now in my model binder here. Same exact code, conference repository get by name, the value I got from MVC's model binding, and then I'll return that conference. So what I've done is I've kind of intercepted MVC's model binding to say, okay, you're getting a string for your value. I'm going to take that string. I'm going to actually pull out the actual conference, and that's what I'm going to use to bind to my model. So I'm just kind of doing a little switcheroo here to say, you were trying to get a string at first, but I'm going to take that string, and I'm going to up you the actual entity and the actual conference object. So what this allows me to do in my conference controller is both my show and edit action, I can replace this with just conference event name. I will delete this line where I pulled out right from the repository. And over here, instead of that piece I pulled out of the repository, I'm going to get the piece that was passed in. The same thing I'm going to do in my edit action. So this is going to be a conference instead of a string, and I'm going to just pass in that conference that I get straight into AutoMapper here. So that was just 2 more lines of code I can or just another line of code I can delete from all my controller actions where I'm pulling something out by ID. So model binder is going to look for something of this type and then locate my model binder that I've configured to then do that model binding of pulling out something by name and supplying the conference object itself. All right, so the last piece I need to do is to actually I've created my model binder. I actually have to register that model binder with MVC. It's not going to use it automatically. I have to tell MVC to use it. It's not a mind reader. Okay. So to add a custom model binder, we use the model binders.binders collection, and the add method takes the type of object I want to filter against, and then the model binder object I'm going to let do the binding. So here I'm telling MVC that whenever you find an object of type conference and the thing you're trying to bind to and the action parameters, I want you to use this object to do the actual binding. So with this line of code here, this configuration, plus this custom model binder, let me rebuild. And now when I reopen my build progress going, now when I open my page, I should still see in my show screen the exact same output. Again, I'm not changing any behavior here. I'm just reducing the amount of code I'm seeing in each of my controller actions. So I'm going to have a question here. Yeah. Okay. So that was custom model binding. I have replaced all this kind of corrupt where I'm pulling stuff out by name or by ID. Just one more line of code I can erase from all the controllers. And now you can see it's getting down to be pretty lean in my controller actions. So the last piece I want to look at took us quite a while actually to figure out and understand and recognize. If I start to look at more and more of my controller actions, I see higher level concepts emerge. In both of these controller actions, you have the same concept of mapping something and showing a view. That's a concept. I am showing information going through AutoMapper. The same thing with my index screen. Here's information I want to show. I am using AutoMapper, and then I'm returning a view. If I just kind of put, instead of conference here, I thought in my head foo, and here over here some other foo. So, it's mapping from foo to bar. Then this is the same thing down here. I'm mapping some foo to some bar, mapping some foo to some bar. So this is a higher level concept I can kind of try to break out and encapsulate in one place where I have this common execution path of using AutoMapper to display a view. So the extension point to help me do that, help eliminate common execution paths and common patterns inside an action, I like to use custom action results for. So what I'd like to do is encapsulate the code of mapping and showing a view into a custom action result, where then I just tell the action result, this is what I want to map to, and I'll let the action result do all the work. So just a quick review of action results. When I execute this action, I'm not actually showing the view right away. This is a way for me to tell MVC that as a result of action, that this action executing, I want to display a view. And here's what I want to display in it. So I'm not telling MVC, here's specifically how to render a view. I'm just telling MVC, I want to render a view. So what I'm going to do is replace these two lines with another piece, which is I want to automap something and render a view. So the first thing I'll need to do is create a custom action result. Again, I already have something built here. It just doesn't have any implementation. So I created this AutoMap View Result class in my helpers folder. Again, this is nothing special about those helpers folders, just where I like to dump these kind of helper classes and things in extension points for MVC. It's just a class that inherits from action result. And the only thing I need to do is implement and override the execute result method. So I pull in my magic again here, bloop, and get rid of the existing one. Okay, so what I've done is I've created an action result class where now I have to give it all the information it needs to perform the mapping and displaying the view. So if you remember back in my conference controller, there are pieces of information that were common, mapper.map, and there are pieces of information that differed. So the source type differed between these guys, the destination type differed between these, and then of course the model that I'm mapping is also different. So all those pieces that are different, I'm going to pull out and make as parameters on my view result. So now I have properties for all those pieces. And then in my execute result method, I'm just going to do exactly what I did before, which is call the mapper.map method. But this time I'm going to use the view model that's passed in, pass the source and destination type, and then I'm going to swap out the view model with the one that was mapped. And then finally, I'm going to just call execute result on the view result was passed in. So a little bit different than I was doing the controllers. In the controllers, I had a model that was different. It turns out that these view methods that create view results on the base controller class are awfully handy. And if I was going to try to replicate all those different functionality in my view result, I'd have a lot of different overloads and a lot of more information I would need. So instead, what I'm doing is you just pass me the view result that you created, and I would just swap out the model with what I have. And then I will just rely on the view result to do its work. This is a really common pattern we see in custom action results where I'm just leaning on an existing action result and I'm just kind of putting some extra little pieces of behavior on top of it. All right, so now that I have my AutoMap view result, the other piece I really like to do is do the same thing that MVC does and create these nice helper methods to create action results. I'm going to do that on my base controller class. So I also tend to create a controller class between the MVC controller class and all of my others so that I have a nice spot to put any kind of extensions, common filters, and things like that. All right, so I'm going to create an AutoMap view method that's going to build this AutoMap view result. So in this AutoMap view method, I pass in a view result, and I tell it the destination type I'm mapping to, and then it's going to do all the work of creating the view result class, figuring out the source type and destination type, and passing in the view result. It's going to do all that. So my controller, all these pieces where I'm calling mapper.map and return view, I can instead just do, yep, I have this all here, the show action. Oops. I can remove these two lines with that one line. In my show action, I'm just going to replace the whole thing. I can now again replace these two lines with this one line of calling AutoMap view. And finally, my edit action is I'm going to do the same thing. Return AutoMap view. So what I've done is just recognize this common concept of mapping and showing a view and just extracted that concept in an action result. And now my controller actions, I'm really just, instead of doing the how of mapping, I just describe what I want to do. This is what I want to do. I want to map to, using AutoMapper, to this destination type, this view information. So I'm just telling MVC what to do, and then all the action results figure out the how. So this is getting pretty crazy where I'm just getting one line controller actions. And that is pretty nice. I can look at the controller action and see exactly what I'm doing here. I am auto-mapping to this model, this view, and this is the piece I pass in. And that's it. Now, we've done a lot with our show actions, our display actions, our gets, but our posts, we haven't touched at all. So in some of our larger projects, we've really found that gets and posts are two completely different animals with two completely different needs, concerns, constraints. They're just doing two different things. I mean, get, I'm executing a query, and a post, I'm doing things like validation, and I'm doing an update. So it's a basic difference between a select and an update or insert. So recognizing this, we started to notice a common pattern. We kept seeing the same pattern of checking model state. If it's not valid, I just show the view with whatever form I pass in. And then if it is valid, then here's the actual work I do. But this work really doesn't have anything to do with checking this other model state junk. In fact, in a lot of our applications, we would extract these, the actual work being done into a service, and that service would actually do the work. But as we started to get more and more controller actions doing this, we saw this higher level concept of separating out processing the validation versus processing the actual form and doing the work of a form. So what I'd like to do is say, let's separate out this work with the pattern of checking model state, doing some work, and then if it's successful, showing some success redirect. So what I'd like to do is create a class to do this piece, and then the rest I'm going to extract into some common action result. So the first piece I need to do is figure out what I need to do for this common piece here. This is going to be different for every single form I'm posting to, but they all have a common pattern of I'm going to handle this form. So that's what I'm going to create is an iForm handler. So let me create that over here. I don't think I have that yet. Form handler? Nope. So I'm going to create class. I'm going to call it iForm handler. And by the power of copy paste, I'm going to put it on my implementation here. So this is a very simple class. It's a generic interface on some T, and I have a void method where I pass in a form type, and the implementation handles the form. So what I want to do is now create an implementation that does exactly this work here. It accepts a conference edit model, and then it does all of this work. So that I've created this handlers folder, and I'm going to create a handler class to actually handle that work. So it's not doing anything now, but again, by the power of copy-paste, I'll pull in my handler. All right, so I create this conference edit model form handler. It implements iForm handler of the actual edit model type. It has a single method, handle, and it accepts that conference edit model. And then I just copy-pasted the exact code I found in the conference controller body, and I pasted it over here, and it's just doing that exact work. But now it's isolated into this one class and not spread across in my controller action. So I look at this responsibility. The only thing this is responsible for doing is accepting a valid form and performing the work associated with that. Okay, again, here I need the conference repository because I'm going to pull out by ID this conference. So that's why you see this constructor here that accepts this conference repository. And I think I extracted a method down here to do some extra piece here. So anyway, this is all the code I found inside my controller action. I've just now pulled out into this separate class. Okay, the next piece I need to do is create an action result that does this exact piece of code here, except instead of doing the work inside here to execute the form, it's going to locate the correct handler and let that do the actual handling of the form. But everything else is going to look exactly the same. The other piece that will change from action to action is where I redirect to on case of success. So that's going to be another parameter I have on my action method. This will change from action to action, so that's something I'll have to pass into my action result. All right, so let me create a form action result. Form action result, and I already have something in here. It's generic based on the model type or the form type I'm executing against. And let me just yank everything in again. Get rid of the blank one I had earlier. Okay, so what I have here is I have three pieces of information I need to work against. That is, what do I do if something fails? Where do I go if it succeeds? And give me also the form object. So that's all I've created here is a constructor that takes the three pieces of information that change from request to request, and then all the common execution path will be in my execute result method. So here, this looks pretty much exactly the same as we saw in our controller action. Our controller action had if model state is valid, return view. Here I'm going to do if model state, to dig a little bit deeper, is valid, then I'm going to execute the failure result because that might change again from action to action. If that succeeds, now I'm going to do the actual work of here. Now here, I've extracted that into a form handler. So in my action result, I'm going to locate the form handler using, again, structure map to say, give me the handler for this form, and I'll just call handle. And then whichever handler it picks up, that's the one it's going to use. At runtime for my conference edit model form handler, the instance located here will be that actual conference edit model form handler, this class right here. And then that will be what gets handled right here. But for each kind of form type, this is going to locate a different form handler. Finally, now that I've executed whatever needs to be done for that form, I will call execute result on the success view result, or the success action result, and whatever that was done, that's what will get executed. One piece I need to do is configure structure map to know about this iForm handler. It's outside of the scope of this talk to explain how it's done, just that I need to do it. So here, this is a common functionality in all modern IOC containers to be able to hook up all of the implementations of some generic interface type with the implementation. So this one line of code is going to hook up all iForm handler of T requests to concrete implementations. That's what that one line of code does. And thank you, Jeremy Miller, for that one. All right, I have my custom action result. I have my handler. The last thing I want to do to get everything set up is to create that helper method here to help me create that custom action result. So let me drag that over again. Here's just, again, a helper method I'm calling, it's called form. So when I use it in a controller action, I'll just say return form. I pass in the form object. I pass in, here I just pass in the success action result. And then here I'm assuming that the failure result is just view, I'm just showing the view again with the form. So that's what we had here, the default. When I fail, I just have the view. I might add other overloads where I can pass in other, if you have to do extra things for the failure, I'd pass on it as well. And then in return, that form action result, that custom thing I created. The passing in the form, the success redirect, and the failure view result. Okay, going back to our conference controller, I can now replace my edit method with a new and improved one. It is now just 2 lines of code where I have all these different concerns of model state and performing domain work here and then redirecting. I'm just going to delete all that, and now it's just 1 line of code here, or 2 lines, sorry. I build up my success result, which is the same redirect to action piece I had before, and then I just return the result of this form method, which builds up that form action result, and then later on, after my action executes, it'll do the actual processing of everything. Let me build. Hopefully everything builds. And go back to my edit screen and make sure that my edit screen is still working properly. So let me click edit. Code mash foo, my favorites, and it worked correctly. I did not change any behavior in my application. I just changed some of the responsibilities. So just to kind of sum things up, trying to say how we got here, we identified a lot of the high-level concepts in our application, things like executing queries, mapping models, retrieving entities, and processing a command. We identified concepts for all those things that were universal across all our controllers, and then we made those concepts explicit with code. So I created classes to represent each of those concepts, and now in my code I can recognize a concept because it's an actual class representing it as opposed to a block of code where I have to mentally think, okay, this is the idea of executing a query, this is the idea of mapping something. Things become a lot more declarative now that I've identified concepts. And by establishing conventions, I can reduce and help eliminate a lot of the code. So the last piece I wanted to show you is kind of where we wanted to end up. And I have an after conference controller after. Let me rename that guy. This is the after view of everything that I've done. I didn't show one piece, which is the encapsulating the execution of a query, but this is where I wanted to get to. where each action is like almost one line or 2 lines of code describing what to do, but not how to do it. So here I'm describing what to do. I'm describing I want to execute a query, and here's my query that I'm executing, this list conferences query. And then here I'm saying show an automat view, and down here I'm saying show a form or execute a form. So when I look at this controller, I'm seeing what needs to be done. The how I can dig into go somewhere else. But now I've made my controller, instead of being figuring out what to do and how to do it, my controller is just figuring out what to do and letting all my conceptual pieces figure out the how. So just to go back and see where we came from, I'll open my before view here. This is what we had before. Scroll, 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 scroll. This is my controller after. Oh, I can actually fit it all in one screen. I think that's a big win. I didn't change the behavior, but I changed the design and improved it, I think, quite a bit. All right, well, that's all I had. If there are any other questions, I'm going to have this code on headspringlabs.coplex.com. A lot more of these concepts are expanded on in our book, ASP.NET MVC2 in Action. And this book can also be found for free on Jeffrey's GitHub page because it's all Creative Commons licensed, but just in ugly Word documents if you want to actually view the book in Word documents.
This presentation was recorded at mvcConf. For more content like this, go to www.mvcconf.com.